Welcome back to the Lap Podcast. This is episode 4, Lando's Arrival.
In this episode, we're talking the dominant Lando Norris win at the Dutch Grand Prix, Ferrari strong weekend at Zandvoort, Williams parting ways with Logan Sargeant ahead of this weekend's Italian Grand Prix, and more.
Welcome back. Man, that was a little bit of a subdued weekend. Not quite as eventful as I think most of us were hoping it to be, with how competitive the front's been. You know, Lando winning, your boy.
Yeah. You can't be mad about Lando winning, right?
No.
We've been wanting this. Not necessarily a boring weekend. And I'm not even talking from just a McLaren standpoint, right? I think, just kind of jumping into it, over 20-second victory for Lando Norris, an incredible drive. I know, subdued, boring, whatever the fill-in-the-blank word you want to use. It was a dominant showing by Lando Norris, not to mention getting an extra point on used hards, might I add, whenever the entire field, was relatively fresher on their tires. Some had softs, and still Lando finished with used hards with the fastest lap. Including, of course, gaining that P1 victory, much deserved. A little boring, sure, but, dominance is to be appreciated.
I think for McLaren, this was a validation kind of weekend, right? I mean, it's a strong showing in the race. I mean, it was a near perfect weekend for Lando Norris. I think I'd probably put it at, if you had to scale it 1 to 100, I think I'd probably put it at about a 90 out of 100, that's still an A grade. That's still amazing. We only have one blemish there, which is the race start, which has been a consistent issue for Lando, of course. That's his curse, it seems like, right now. And that's the last little hill he has to overcome. But if that's the only hill, I think that's fine. Yeah,
I agree. And we kind of talked about this off air. It almost does feel like the win was a little diluted by just how bad McLaren needed it. I mean, the McLaren needed it. Lando needed it. It was just starting to get too many questions around the McLaren garage around, can Lando do it? Is he going to be able to do it? Is he going to pass him on merit like we've talked about on many, many occasions? Mm-hmm. An impeccable, beautiful race by Lando. Much deserved win. And I think it kind of I won't want to say it puts McLaren on the map because McLaren has already been on the map. But I think it just kind of solidifies hey, they're there and they're going to compete. And this race for not only the constructors, but this race for the driver championship is on.
No, I think I would agree. This was a statement weekend for McLaren and especially Lando Norris. At qualifying, beat out Max Verstappen by about 3.5 tenths for pole, which was, that's monster. Especially with how close the competition has been for this, middle third of the season, so to speak.
And doing it on the last lap, might I add, clutching up and grabbing that pole position for qualifying was huge.
Yeah. He, again, succumbing to his biggest fault with the lap 1 slow start, but trailing for a little while, passing Max on merit at lap 18, though. And then he covered off Max with the pit strategy. This is where you give a little bit of a round of applause to the McLaren pit wall.
Which they need, yeah.
They covered off on lap 29 with their pit to the hard tires, eventually won the race by 22 seconds. That is, this season, by the way, the largest margin of victory. I think Max had a 22.5 second win in Bahrain to open the year when we all thought it was going to be doom, gloom again.
Yep.
And then this was 22.8. Man, it's a statement win. You talked about this opening up the championship, and I think that the constructors is absolutely game on, right? Last weekend, I mentioned my bold prediction was that McLaren would have the constructors lead by Austin. I still feel very firm and very strong about that prediction. However, a 70-point gap to Max, I think what would really, and I mean really open up this championship potentially is if Max doesn't finish with points one weekend. It would take something that drastic, and Lando still has to win. And let's say he gets a fastest lap. That's a 50-something point or a 40-something point margin at that point, if I'm not mistaken. I think my math is right. No, it'd be 54-point margin with 8 races to go in theory. That would still open up the championship. It would make things a lot closer. Lando right now, in order to secure the Drivers' Championship, would have to secure a 9-point margin of victory every single race weekend between now through Abu Dhabi.
Yeah, and I think this is a fantastic point to bring up someone else in the McLaren garage, in Oscar Piastri. I don't want to sit here and say it was a disappointing weekend for Piastri. Charles Leclerc raced his butt off. It was a great weekend for Ferrari. We'll touch on that a little bit later. But Oscar is going to be a very pivotal part in not only McLaren taking over and winning this Constructors if they do, but also, and we kind of talked about this off air as well, helping Lando win the drivers championship. He's going to have to help fend off Max. He's going to have to lock out the bottom, just get the bottom of the pole. If not, take P2 a couple of times, lock out the top. And Oscar had, like I said, I don't want to say a rough weekend. He got caught in a really bad spot with Charles. We talked about the McLaren not really racing very well in dirty air. Oscar's going to have to step up and show out to help Lando and help McLaren secure that driver championship. Finished just under 0.2 of a second behind Charles Leclerc. I think Oscar is going to be that final piece, kind of like that unsung hero that McLaren's going to need to show up and show out if they want to win both.
Yeah, he's going to kind of have to pull points off of Max Verstappen here, right? So the idea being that if Lando right now in his current form is a current championship level driver, which I think is arguable, right? I mean, over the course of this season, we've talked a number of times about both the McLaren drivers having, flawed drives at certain points. But let's say for the sake of argument, Lando is right next to Max as far as talent, right? And ability. You still need your teammate to come up big for you. And having Oscar, even in his second year, I think it does apply a certain amount of pressure. Understanding, look, obviously he's out of the championship for the drivers. As a team, they're in prime position to win the Constructors. Why not do it and see if there's an opportunity to pull off the double stack, right, of the driver and the constructor for McLaren? From an organizational standpoint, that would be huge. Helping Oscar get his first win, right? At the time, it was one of the first episodes of this podcast, was talking how controversial that win was. But on the headsets coming through the comms, they're talking about how it takes a team to win a championship, right? And how you're going to need Oscar to perform to win a championship. Speaking to Lando, I'm trying to remember the name of the race engineer. His race engineer speaking to Lando that weekend. And how, as controversial as that win was, we now see the landscape here. I think Oscar absolutely is tasked with the hardest job here. Like, I mean, of course, winning races is already tough enough if you're Lando, but the car is the best right now on the grid. I don't think that that's really arguable. Overall, it's a strong car. It's quick in the slow speed corners, high speed corners. It's one of the faster cars, especially on the straights. Maybe not the fastest, but they pick up everywhere else. You're going to need Oscar to effectively be the one fighting Max now. I think if you're a McLaren fan, of course you're going to root for both your drivers, right? You're going to be incredibly excited. The performance is finally here. The upgrades are here. The emphasis really does come down to Oscar at this point. If you have that hope, you need to create that margin between Max and Lando. Oscar has to be your perfect buffer.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you can't really add it any more than that. I do want to give just a quick note for the listeners at home. Currently, just reading off the top of it, the driver standings as it sits, Max, Lando, Charles. Max leads Lando by 70 points, and Lando leads Charles by 33. And then over on the constructor side of things, Red Bull has 434 points, McLaren behind them by only 30 points, and then Ferrari behind McLaren by 34 points as well. After that, it gets a little farther with Mercedes behind Ferrari by 94. But that is kind of the lay of the land between the drivers and the constructors, just so that way you know the points and how they sit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good information there. Speaking, and just to kind of wrap up on the McLaren points to lead off this podcast, they did also bring some upgrades this weekend. Going into the summer break, McLaren had slowly but effectively deployed a series of upgrades that made them a title contender. In post-summer break, they brought more additions to this package that helped continue that upward development, and obviously it paid off. They added a new rear wing to increase some downforce. They revised the floor, some new suspension shrouding, rear beam wings, shoulder cooling layouts, and even some brake cooling layouts. McLaren to their credit. I mean, they just haven't taken any steps backwards since Austria last year. And now they're in a position to not only, again, take the constructors, but have the opportunity to fight for a driver's championship. I think, it's still a Herculean effort for that to happen, for Lando to really pry this title away from Max, considering just how talented and how consistent Max is, even with that car not quite being as far away from the field anymore, right? It's still a Herculean effort. My hat's off, golf claps over to McLaren for how strong they've been over the last, year plus with this development package. They've done a lot. The team should be absolutely proud. And the fact that they're even in this position right now, it just enhances my excitement, not only for the remaining races this year, but when everybody's got an even playing field on the points side next year, what that title fight could really look like. If McLaren could continue this upward trajectory, right? Like Red Bull have hit their ceiling. They've said as much. And McLaren can still keep finding time. It's possible that next year it's going to be McLaren's title for the taking, right? From both sides. So that's just something to think about as we head towards these final, chunk of races. But there's obviously a lot more to talk about from this weekend. I want to transition over to P2. I want to talk about Max Verstappen, a more subdued Max Verstappen this past race weekend. He struggled with some rear grip. He was complaining a little bit about that during the race, and it was a big contributor as to why Lando was able to take him out on lap 18. That overall lack of grip, especially with the rear end instability. It looks like there are a couple of ghosts that were haunting like the Mercedes team and the Ferrari team very recently have started to creep into the, Red Bull pit. Max still maintains that lead over Lando, 9 races to go, but I will say this, from a temperament standpoint, Max seemed a lot more subdued this weekend. The summer break was good to the man. He came back and wasn't quite as feisty on the radio, but my question's really going to be for how long? Like, Red Bull have seemingly hit that development ceiling. The constructors is falling away from them. With Max's skill, he's been able to gather loads of points to keep himself, at bay from that charge, but again, barring a DNF or a non-points finish, I think Max's title could very well be in jeopardy. Maybe. I'm not entirely confident as of right now with no DNFs, but Norris would still need to outscore Max again by 9 points per weekend over the next 9 weekends. But I think Verstappen has great odds to secure the title, 4th in a row, but that one DNF could absolutely put this championship back in play for all parties involved.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of points that you leave on the table if you DNF. And it's not like Max has a history of DNFing. If it ever has happened, one, it's been, a wreck with, being a little racy with Lewis or, Lando or fill in the blank. But
they had a DNF early in the season in Australia.
Yeah, and also, sometimes there's been in the past where, that engine gives them problems or a multitude of issues where they've had a DNF. But that being said, it would even be tough. This isn't Checo Perez. it would be tough to even be a betting man and assume that Max would DNF just one time before the end of the year. It's not. I mean,
they have replaced the engine, by the way. Going into the summer break at Belgium, they did completely replace that engine, if I'm not mistaken, or at least some major components.
Right. No, I'm just saying, you can't, as a team, assume hey, there's gonna be a weekend where Max doesn't score points, right? It's not anything you can prepare for. So you just have to do your damnedest, go out there, race the best race you can, bring the upgrades that you can, and that goes for the main 4 contenders in McLaren, Mercedes, Ferrari, and of course Red Bull.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and speaking about how close things are, right? And having to try your hardest and bring it every single weekend. I think the pressure, though, overall is still massively on McLaren's side, right? Especially within this little title fight. Because Lando's margin for error is razor thin, right? He can't afford to not win races anymore at this point. I think at this level, the only way the championship gets reopened is if Max DNFs, right? If you don't win every single race, that is, if you're Lando Norris. Even finishing P2 right now, if you're not at least hoping that Max falls into P6 or P7 or something of that nature, Max is so consistent and so robotic, right? So talented that even in a Red Bull that is clearly off the interval, right? Clearly off the prime pace. He's still putting it on the podium and still finishing in P2. Now, maybe you could argue, okay, it was a home race, and, of course he's going to do well at the Netherlands, but this is the first time we've seen somebody not named Max Verstappen win this race since its return in the 1980s. So, all I'm saying is, like, Max is still that talented. He is still that guy. The onus is still going to be on McLaren to not screw this up. And if overall they have some more gaps, right? Like a gaffe on the pit wall or a tire strategy, or Lando, loses it coming out of a certain corner and the gaps fall back into reaching distance for Max, right? Or he doesn't land on pole post-qualifying, right? I think every single race weekend, if you're a McLaren fan, is probably some of the most anxiety-inducing moments of this season, just because you're hoping that it's possible. The Constructors feels very much in play. You're almost comfortable within that reality. But if you're hoping and praying on that Lando championship, every single race win, every qualifying is going to be, it's walking on glass.
Yeah, it's gonna kind of be like this past weekend. For me especially. Yeah, if this is your first time listening, I'm the resident McLaren fan, and Tristan over here is the resident Mercedes fan. So for me, it's gonna kind of be like, man, we really need Lando to win. We really need Lando to win. If he doesn't win, I'm upset. And if he does, it's like, oh, thank the heavens that he won. Mm-hmm. All right, what's next?
Yeah. But
that's just how winning goes, baby.
But that's not how it's been. It's not normal for Lando, right? This is only a second race win.
That's not really normal for McLaren.
Yeah.
In general, I did some quick research. The last time that McLaren won both the constructors and the drivers' championships was 1998.
Mika Hakkinen?
Yep.
Yeah.
It's been a while, and it's definitely in due time. Mm-hmm. McLaren has not been a winning team.
They've won some driver championships since then. And
but I'm talking. Well. I understand. I'm saying in general, like, they have not been a dominant here to stay kind of team, and this could be the beginning stages of something that could happen. But bringing it back to Red Bull, it is in their hands.
Yeah.
It is in their hands.
Look, I think at a certain level, you do have to kind of be bullish about these kind of things, where we've seen 7 race winners this season, and every one of those winners have a great opportunity to repeat, right?
Right.
Lando obviously just now got his second win. The only other 2 drivers on the grid this year to have multiple race wins are Max and Lewis. But every weekend now, the margins are so much thinner. I think it's more or less, and maybe not to like dash any hopes, but why I'm so bullish on like Lando really taking this championship. I think the only way, again, it comes open is if there's a DNF on Max's side, or for some reason he's scoring like P10 finish, and it's a drastic just failing on Red Bull's part. But right now things are still lined up. That 70-point gap, while let's say like 7 or 8 races ago, like 70 points is super thin. But as we get closer and closer to the end of the season, and considering who the competition is, Max has been here, done that. This would be his 4th drivers' championship. Lando is now potentially fighting for his 1st. So the onus is a lot more on McLaren here. And unfortunately, maybe not unfortunately, but the reality is Red Bull they hit it from the start.
Right.
They had like 9 of the first 10 race wins, if I'm not mistaken. They were dominant to start the season. Max already has 8 or 9 wins this season.
Yeah.
So yes, the onus still comes down to McLaren not screwing up. I think that's overall my hard prediction here is look, I think McLaren can actually still take this constructors. But if you're asking me right now, I still think Max wins the title.
And I think that's a fair fight. I think that's a fair thing to say. And you kind of already spoke about it, and I don't want to spend too long on this, but you already kind of spoke about it. If Lando doesn't win this year, next year's a clean slate, and you bring these upgrades, you repeat this car, before those new regulations, then you have a legit chance of taking both. And, for McLaren fans and even for F1 fans, I might be off my rocker, but I don't think Lando is going to be winning races by 20 plus seconds every weekend. So This isn't anything to get used to. Formula One's not boring. Don't worry. I don't want that discussion to start again.
I don't know that we're quite under new management yet, No,
I definitely don't think so. I think this was just a weekend that the McLaren nailed. some other teams
just
got right as well.
Yeah, be happy with it. It was solid. I mean, yeah, speaking of other teams that hit it, I mean, a strong weekend for Ferrari, right?
Really good weekend for Charles Leclerc in specifics, too.
Yeah, I mean, landing P3, hitting the podium, a strong drive up to P5, by the way, for Carlos Sainz. Ferrari haven't reportedly brought any upgrades, but they had a really strong result versus their Mercedes counterparts, of course. I think maybe this is, don't call it partial, this is just my view, right? My view of this weekend, I think it was a very circuit characteristic specific thing that allowed Ferrari to really come alive during the race pace.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much all these teams performed as you would expect them to perform based on track and how their car is suitable for that track.
Yeah, overall, because nothing has changed. Like, Mercedes didn't bring any upgrades, Ferrari didn't bring any upgrades. If anything, Mercedes kind of bobbled their strategy, which we'll touch on after Ferrari. But sometimes you just have a circuit that lines up well with what your car does. Like, Ferrari have notably kind of struggled over the last series of races ever since Monaco, not getting any race wins, kind of hitting some podiums, but not really, being in the reaching distance to win races anymore. But sometimes you just land at a circuit that works really well for you. There's a lot more slower speed, weaving, cornering for Ferrari to kind of capitalize on, versus where Mercedes were successful over the last couple of years. Their car is completely different now. It actually suits a lot better to the higher speed, more straight line, high speed cornering circuits that you saw out of Red Bull last year, for instance. So look, overall though, still massive props to Ferrari. I mean, nonetheless, a much needed podium this weekend for the Tifosi as we go into Monza. Of all places, by the way. I mean, if you're a Ferrari fan, you're probably very excited to see what they can do this year. And we'll talk about our Monza predictions towards the end of today's episode. But look, overall, again, I'm doing a lot of golf clapping today, but some golf claps for Ferrari. They had a really, really, really strong weekend at Zandvoort. But transitioning over to Mercedes, they did struggle. Mercedes struggled. A P3 start for George Russell.
Some minus golf claps for the Merc.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't been able to really usually I wear a Mercedes cap or something, right? Today I'm wearing none of it. It was just a disappointing weekend, if I'm being completely honest.
I think you're wearing the Williams shirt for our American GOAT, Logan Sargeant. Is that correct? We'll talk about that later.
R.I.P. Look, a P3 start for George Russell, though. Lewis Hamilton completely missing Q3 and being tagged with a penalty. He started P14. Look, they met in the middle, a P7 and a P8 finish, a really strong drive from Lewis. I think some strategy kind of cost George towards the end there when they pit him at lap 55 after getting passed by Piastri on lap 40, trying to cobble something together on those softs. It just seemed like it was a little bit too late to really fight towards the podium once again. But an impressive weekend for Lewis, solid drive. But prior to the break, they won 3 of the last 4 races. To walk out of Zandvoort with just 10 points while you're trying to chase Ferrari for the P3 in the constructors is very lackluster. So overall, again, I just think it was a very struggle weekend for Mercedes, but not a typical weekend. Maybe the circuit characteristics didn't quite play to what their car does, right? We just talked about how it probably played more into Ferrari's hands versus what Mercedes have done in the more recent history with higher speed circuits. Not a lot of straight line speed you're going to get out of Zandvoort, except for that final turn 14 onto the primary straight before turn 1. So kind of a wash weekend. Nothing to write home about. You just move forward, move on. If you're a Mercedes, I don't think this is anything to really get hung up on. You just consider, okay, some of the upgrades at Belgium didn't quite work. We're going to just reassess Zandvoort. They got the data there. Maybe they'll bring something this weekend. It's going to be a very exciting weekend for a couple of members of the Ferrari team as we head into Monza. But I don't really think it's anything to get lose sleep over if you're Mercedes. It's just a tough weekend. Sometimes it doesn't really go your way.
Yeah, I mean, there ain't really much to add. Being that you're the resident Mercedes fan, I was just going to kind of let you just kind of vent there for a little bit.
Well, I appreciate it.
Just you got to get your sorrows out when you
panic,
can.
Right? Yeah, just don't panic.
No panic needed. And I am a king of teases today. We'll talk more about Mercedes and what we could expect from them going into Monza.
Yeah. Well, we can move on, though. There are still a couple of more stories that are surrounding the Netherlands, the Dutch Grand Prix, excuse me. Haas, being held hostage. Apparently, the Haas equipment was impounded in the Netherlands at the circuit after the former title sponsor, Urkali, they're a Russian company. They forced the team to pay them back $9 million of sponsorship money.
9 million buckaroos.
Yeah, after they dissolved the partnership in 2022 amid Russia's war with Ukraine. Excuse me. So the money was wired. There was an injunction placed on the Haas team, though, so they weren't able to pull their stuff out until, I believe, Tuesday. I don't know, pretty wild story. It puts them a couple days behind the rest of the grid, and as everybody else got to Monza a little bit early because we have a back-to-back race weekend. But any quick thoughts on this? Like, it's a weird story.
Yeah, I mean, for those that know, sometimes you get like butt crack sports, on Twitter or whatever. You read a report and it's like, oh, that sounds fake, and then you read it and you turn out it is fake.
Mm-hmm.
But it gives you a good old laugh. I saw it and I was like, this has to be fake. And then I kept seeing it. And I was like, wow, this is a wild thing to be happening in the middle of a Formula One season.
Yeah, the first impressions I got were that, like, Haas,
or in general, I guess.
Like, something about, like, Urkali, like, trying to take the team in its entirety. So I was like, okay, that doesn't really make sense. I mean, Russia's involvement, yada, yada, like, they're completely off the grid right now. And for obvious reasons. So I was like, okay, that just seems really weird. I'm just going to move on, right?
Well, and another thing.
Somebody else brought it up to me, and they didn't really seem to know exactly what was going on. And then as we went through the actual race weekend, figuring out, oh, no, like, they owed $9 million back to their sponsor. It's a lot more simple and cut dry, I guess, but still, like, a really awkward place to be. Why wouldn't you have just paid them back the money in the first place?
There's a lot of questions around Haas, and also, not to get into too much of the legalities of things, but their owner Gene is not even allowed in majority European countries too. So it's just like a lot of fishy things going on behind the scenes with Haas.
Strong season, but off the grid, there's still a couple of things happening behind the scenes, I guess. But that was just a quick little aside that happened. Moving forward, as we approach the Italian Grand Prix, some really big news out of the Williams camp. Logan Sargeant out. Franco Colapinto
gone but not forgotten.
And gone but not forgotten. Do you have any parting words for Logan Sargeant? I mean, you're a McLaren fan first, but as American Formula One fans, our representation on the grid, now missing.
I mean, you're gonna start up the waterworks over here. Logan Sargeant, if you're out there, if you're listening to this, thank you for what you've done. Not only have you single-handedly brought America back into Formula One with your excitement and driving skills, but you are more than likely destined for IndyCar. And for that, we are thankful. And we look forward to keeping up with your track. And I have no doubt in my mind whatsoever that you will dominate wherever you go next. And will we ever have a race win with Logan Sargeant? No, we will not. But what we will have that will forever live on is that picture of him getting out of his car that is inflamed with a crash that he did, yes, cause. But that picture will live on forever. And that is something Max Verstappen does not have.
A flaming Williams picture?
Yes.
Okay, let me break down the actual news, and then I guess I'll throw my hair of an opinion in here. Look, Wednesday morning, Williams and Formula One were announcing that American driver Logan Sargeant was being replaced by Williams Academy driver Franco Colapinto, who's currently P6 in the F2 driver standings. And I know you're doing a lot of research on Colapinto, so maybe you'll unearth some information about him as we move forward here. But Sargeant, look, unfortunately, he never really put it together in his time in Formula One. I think he had like 1 or 2 point-scoring weekends. His first point-scoring weekend in Austin, which was so romantic, but the reality of how he got those points was going from a non-points finish to Lewis and Leclerc being disqualified that weekend, granting him his first points.
Points are points, okay? I don't need this.
Look, I get it.
Logan Sargeant slander from
This
you.
isn't slander. This is the truth. This is how it happened. So
No, all jokes aside, yeah, it wasn't a fantastic season for Sargeant. It obviously wasn't the direction that James Vowles is wanting to go.
look, a mid-season drop though is still tough for any driver.
It is.
We talked
It's
about
tough
Checo.
for the confidence.
We talked about Checo at length and how Red Bull were probably going to sack him, and he's still on the grid. And respect to Checo, his best race weekend since China, P6. But it's tough, man. I mean, it looked like Williams were going to hold on to Logan throughout at least the rest of the season, and then I think possibly the straw that broke the camel's back was that aura-inducing crash that you were just mentioning.
Actually heard
in FP3.
Yeah, I've actually heard and seen some rumors or speculation, if you will, that Sargeant knew possibly going into that race that they were going to be done with him going into Monza either way.
You think so? Where are you going with this? Do you think that he threw it into the wall just to
No.
just to go? I'm taking the chassis with me.
I'm not suspecting any of that. I'm just saying that I think.
No, he's a professional. I get it.
Yeah, I think either way, I think he might have already known going into that might have been his last go around. Either way, Franco Colapinto, the first Argentinian driver in over 20 years, 2 decades, 21 years old, joined Williams in January 2023 as one of the reserve drivers. Like you already spoke about his how he's doing in Formula 2. He has multiple single-seater titles. And then he actually has raced in Formula 1 this year. He completed 24 laps at Silverstone during FP1.
So he got his practice session.
Yes.
Gotcha.
So
as far as Colapinto's role here, obviously, even keeping up with our news cycle, we talked about this at length as well. Carlos Sainz, of course, being signed to Williams for next year and beyond. Alex Albon is signed through next year and beyond. So Colapinto isn't trying to make his name, or at least not trying to fight for a grid spot necessarily here with Williams for the rest of the season. This, to me, looks like a reserve role. Okay, this is where we get the reps in. This is where we figure out and see what we've got here for our potential reserve role driver. We've graduated him up early from Formula 2. We just want to see what we've got here. If I'm being completely honest, I think the expectations can't be very high. With all due respect to where Logan Sargeant was on the grid, the expectations can't be much higher than that, right? So Colapinto, his first race weekend, I know seems like a very quick development. He would have been racing Formula 2 this upcoming weekend, but now he's going to be driving, his dream achieved, much like any of these other young guys. Getting to Formula 1 at all is something to hang your hat on. To be able to race these final, chunk of races for the season, even for a backmark team, it's still something to be proud of. I think Colapinto, overall, though, yeah, this is his proving ground to make himself the official reserve driver for at least the next year or two. And we've seen guys go from that reserve role and graduate into other race seats, right? Nico Hülkenberg spent his time as a reserve driver. Esteban Ocon. Currently, Mick Schumacher is the Mercedes reserve driver alongside Frederick Vesti. Last year's F2 champion Felipe Drugovich is the reserve driver for Aston Martin. Got guys like Liam Lawson who've been hanging around the paddock. So being a reserve driver isn't necessarily the worst place to be. It's not. It's compared to, of course, Alex Albon and Carlos Sainz. Of course, you're not going to overtake those guys for race seats, but being around the grid, you get a higher level of exposure. You're still doing media. You're still participating, and you're contributing to the team through sim work. So,
but not only that, and just before you go to your next topic, but imagine, for Colapinto, he's going to be able to not only just this year, but next year, whenever he sticks around, he's going to be able to sit behind and learn from Carlos Sainz and Alex Albon.
Yeah.
Those are two really good, really talented drivers. I know Albon is a little bit more on the younger side, of course, but Sainz is as a driver who's been through it all. He's won, he's gone through the ups and the downs, raced for Ferrari, back in Williams, trying to make another name for himself on a team that needs some help. And that's a lot. There's a lot to learn from at being 21 years old.
Absolutely. So look, this is still a great opportunity. He's the first Argentinian driver in 23 years. The last one, Gaston Mazzacane, if I'm not mistaken, is how you say his name. Raced 21 Grand Prix with Minardi and Prost in 2000 and 2001. So from a nationality standpoint, the Argentinian fan base that is there, they have somebody to root for at least the second chunk of this season. Tough break for Logan, of course. Resident American fans here. It's unfortunate to watch, one of our first drivers in quite a while, get the axe the way he got it. But to be completely fair, I think the speculation was that we were all kind of surprised going into this season that he was still going to be there at a certain level. I mean, the performance his rookie year wasn't great. You gave him the opportunity going into his second year. I think at this part of the season, you wouldn't have expected them to make that move. We talked about Red Bull possibly making moves going into the the United States Grand Prix. That would have felt like maybe a more feasible or a more palatable gateway to make that driver swap. But, Williams and James Vowles, they have their plan. They've got their map laid out. And look, just because losing Logan Sargeant is rough and his fan base, they're going to take it to heart. But we're still incredibly happy for Franco Colapinto. I mean, look, a dream does come true even with this sad news this week. But speaking of more drivers trying to make their way up the ranks, we've got some driver market, speculation. I mean, we're going to have one Formula 2 driver who's graduating in Colapinto, but we might very well see our next Formula 2 driver make his, soft debut this weekend. My boy, you know him, you love him. Kimi Antonelli's getting an FP1 practice session with Mercedes this weekend.
Shout out Toto Wolff for being the direct source. Have you ever seen like one of those memes where it's like, hey bro, what's your source? And it's like source and it's me. That was literally Toto Wolff over the weekend, accidentally leaking that Antonelli had already pretty much signed, sealed, and delivered that he was going to be the driver alongside George whenever it's all said and done.
It's not official.
It was a slip. I mean, whatever. Not official. It literally came from him.
Look, I am of the mindset that until we see the Formula One breaking tweet or the Mercedes announcement official.
With how these recordings have gone for our podcast, will probably come out 5 minutes after we're done.
Look, you're not entirely wrong.
Shout out to Central Standard Time.
Yeah, exactly. We do still have 3 seats left to fill, technically. But look, it looks like Mercedes is going to tap Kimi Antonelli. Look, he's going to be driving George's car for FP1, if I'm not mistaken. He's going to get his first, look in front of the Italian fans. He'll be the first Italian driver potentially in quite some time. Excuse me. But moving aside from Kimi Antonelli, as excited as I am, there are still a couple other race seats that we, still have to talk about. Since our last podcast, Alpine promoted Jack Doohan to drive alongside Pierre Gasly in 2025 after Esteban Ocon departing for Haas broke, graduating Doohan from the reserve driver role, like we talked about at length here, up to the Formula One seat. Another Australian on the grid. You'd love to see it. I mean, from all reports he's a good guy and, incredibly excited for his family. He's done all the right things to put himself in this position. And to be fair, Alpine were not necessarily, competing at the top of the driver's market, but this isn't a bad thing in the slightest. Doohan's done everything right. I'm sure he'll be a more than commensurate teammate across from Pierre Gasly in 2025. The tension certainly couldn't be any higher than what it has been for the last 2 seasons between Gasly and Ocon. So, excited for Jack Doohan. Happy for that announcement. But we're still looking at Sauber to pair Nico Hülkenberg with somebody, and V-Carb to find Yuki Tsunoda's teammate. So, what do we think? What do we think as far as, let's start with Sauber. Do we still believe that Valtteri Bottas is going to be the guy across the grid there?
I think Bottas ends up in Audi land.
Yeah,
to be honest, I think the speculations. I think I've said it before, where there's smoke, there's typically fire, especially, in my early learnings of the Formula One world, man. Rumors tend to be true more often than they aren't if you follow the right sources. And I think Bottas will end up being an Audi. I don't entirely know what Kick Sauber is going to do. I don't know if it really matters other than just having news to talk about, but man, they have been really bad this year.
Look, they're trying to transition up to becoming Audi. So I think Bottas, he does have a place on this grid. That's my opinion. I mean, he's a very marketable driver. He's a very steady, consistent driver, a very good teammate. Excuse me. I like this move. I think if this is what will happen, I do think this is what will happen. But there's always a chance that somebody else gets that opportunity. Audi are a German team. They've already got their German driver, Nico Hülkenberg, signed for the next few years. I wonder if Mick Schumacher gets his second opportunity with the German-based team. I wonder how feasible that is. Because Toto Wolff has done nothing but praise Mick since he's walked into that reserve role. There's obviously a yearning for at least the fan base to see Mick back out on the grid. He's a former F2 champion, if I'm not mistaken. The kid can drive, just, tough sledding when he was at Haas. So, I mean, I'm saying I think it's going to be Bottas. I think that's the safe pick. I think that's the fair pick. It's an older lineup, if we're being honest here, between Hülkenberg and Bottas if that happens. But I still like that lineup. But, man, if Mick gets his second opportunity to drive for Sauber at least next year, gets a prove-it deal, I'll still be incredibly excited.
Yeah, I mean, we don't know enough. We don't know enough about Mick.
He's been on the sidelines for a while.
Yeah, he's been on the sidelines for a while. Probably, kind of we talked about being behind some really good drivers. He's been on the sidelines learning, soaking up, and just taking notes and doing a lot of training and, probably doing a lot of sim racing and a lot of those different things that you do as a reserve role driver. We don't know enough about Mick to decide, is he a guy or is he not yet, right? I would also be excited if he lands a seat really anywhere. Sauber probably leading candidate for that decision, but if he landed a seat anywhere in 2025 and beyond, I'm excited because I want to see if Mick can be one of those guys that can, he has high expectations. I understand that with, his father and everything like that. But I just want to see what he can be. No expectations, nothing like that. I just want to see what he can provide. And I think if he does end up going with Sauber, I think that would be a good opportunity for him.
As they transition to Audi, too, I mean, the expectations wouldn't be drastic. It would just be a matter of like, hey, keep the car on track and try to pick up points, right?
Right, yeah.
So I
would they have a total of
0, right?
None this year. So, that'd be great.
Look, we still have one more seat to figure out, too. V-Carb, figuring out Yuki Tsunoda's teammate. I think this entire saga really just kind of comes down to Checo. We've talked about this at length. Checo's still on that hot seat, in my opinion. A P6 finish is not nearly enough, in my opinion, to secure your seat moving forward. So
he was like a lineman. No one talked about him because he didn't crash the car.
Yeah.
But he also didn't do enough to be like, Checo had a good weekend. I was like, he didn't crash the car.
It was an expectation weekend, if anything.
It was like, he saved himself a week.
I still feel like V-Carb are going to probably end up tapping Liam Lawson. He's so due. He was competing next to and even better than Yuki Tsunoda at times last year. It feels like it's inevitable, but it just comes down to what are they going to do with, Danny Rick, and what are they going to do with Checo? Somebody has to go. It's not a bad problem to have too many good drivers. It's a great problem to have, in fact, but who gets the axe at the end of that day? Scooting forward, though, this is another race weekend. We are creeping into Monza, and I think it's time. Do we have any race predictions as we start to near the end of this episode?
Yes. So I think. Well, first, here's one thing we kind of talked about this off air, and we talked about a couple of things off air. That's why I mentioned it. Mercedes, Ferrari, and McLaren. I think are the three teams that are primed and ready to take a pole position somehow, some way. I think you could see a good weekend from Mercedes, kind of like a bounce back weekend. I think they could bring some upgrades. I think that is a true potential. Maybe that's why they didn't want to mess with bringing upgrades to Zandvoort last weekend. Maybe they're ready for Monza. I think Ferrari could pose a threat this weekend. Maybe not for a race win. P2, P3, I could see Charles kind of getting in the mix there. Once again, another good weekend from him. And obviously, McLaren, I think they could put together another really good weekend. And maybe not a win, maybe locking out the bottom of the podium, something along those lines. And you always have to be aware of Max. Just don't really know what that Red Bull car is going to be able to bring. If Lando can podium, if he can get on the top pole, can he put together a good start? I mean, this is what we can't stop talking about it. A perfect weekend, 97 out of 100, you didn't have a good start. And I think that's just going to be the thing. And maybe that's just something he's not good at. Maybe he just doesn't have a good start and he tries to pass on merit. Maybe that's a thing.
Maybe it's just a McLaren issue. Because Oscar
that's
had a
also
bad start, right?
It's very well could be possibly a McLaren issue. But yeah, those are my predictions. I think Ferrari, Mercedes, and McLaren are the three teams that could really mix it up. And if I have a prediction...
So you're throwing Red Bull completely out of the race win mix?
No. I think those are the three teams to look at to mix it up. I think you should assume every weekend that Max is going to finish in the polls somewhere, somehow.
You mean top 5?
Yeah, top 5 at least. I'd be surprised if he finishes top 5, to be honest. But that being said, I think it could be like a one racer from each team kind of mix up this weekend. I think McLaren could get in there. I think Mercedes, more than anything, I know I'm kind of going around the ringer here. More than anything, I think Mercedes is going to put together a good weekend and could possibly bring some upgrades.
So I think you and I are philosophically around the same place. I think Merc are back fighting for the win. That car, like I've mentioned, 3 out of the last 4, winning at Belgium, which is a very high-speed circuit. That Merc thrives in the high speeds. I think Red Bull are likely in the mix this weekend. I really do. McLaren, of course. When
we say Red Bull, we mean Max. We mean Max.
Sure.
I just want to clarify. There's Mercedes, there's McLaren, there's Ferrari, and then there's Max.
I think that McLaren are going to be in that mix. I think Ferrari take a step back in comparison to Zandvoort.
Okay.
Again, it's a circuit.
So finish outside the top 5?
Yes.
Okay.
I think that maybe you get Leclerc in there, but I don't think both cars finish in the top 5.
Okay.
If you had to ask me from a 1 to 5, we'll go 5 to 1. We can keep it interesting. Leave you in suspense here. I think 5th place, Charles. I think Charles finishes in 5th place. I think 4th place, I'm going to go Oscar. I'm going to go P3 Max. Ooh, this starts to get really tough. I did not think... This is all off the cuff. P2...
I've got mine, if you need a minute.
You already have it laid out?
Yeah.
No, I'm already starting.
Okay.
P2. I think P2 Lando. I think P1 Lewis. I think Lewis gets his third win.
You
of
are
the
definitely Mercedes fanning this weekend.
It is high-speed car. I think he's going to want to show out for the Tifosi as he begins his transition over to Ferrari.
You think this Ferrari energy is going to come out this weekend?
Yes, this will be the first weekend. I'm sure that everybody in the stands are rooting not only for Ferrari, which is of course,
like, hey, let's win Ferrari, but also.
But if Lewis wins, it's not a bad thing, right? I really think that they're going to put it together this weekend. Okay. I honestly think that it could very well be a Mercedes. This is me being really ambitious. I think it could be a Mercedes 1-2, but. If not, I think George could very well be in that mix. It's really tough this year, but that's my off the cuff. I said it and I wasn't gonna go super far back on it. I'll just put it like that.
All right, I think I'm gonna switch with you. I think Carlos finishes P5. I could see either George or Lewis in P4 personally. I think Oscar. Do I have to pick a Mercedes to finish?
This
P4?
Is your top 5, fam.
All right, okay. All right. Mercedes somewhere at P4. I think Oscar and Lando lock out the bottom, and I could see Max probably winning this weekend.
Really?
Yeah.
Really? I'm surprised by that.
And if it doesn't fall in that order, I would say I could see George winning this weekend. And if George wins this weekend, I see Lando finishing P2.
Yeah.
And if George wins this weekend, then that means that it's going to be a good weekend for Mercedes. And that means I could probably predict Lewis P3, P4.
I mean, look.
Something like that.
Again, this is just like, we're all talking about this
is literally
mix.
Off the cuff. We did not talk about this beforehand.
Yeah.
Probably should have. But yeah, that was off the cuff thinking.
I didn't write anything down for this. But no, I think it's fair to say that Mercedes are going to be right up there near the top, though. The circuit characteristics just work so well for that car. Even if they don't bring any upgrades, I know McLaren brought some. It's probably going to help with their straight line speed. But I don't expect Mercedes to bring some massive upgrade package.
Also, what I'm probably going to do every weekend, since Every weekend I've predicted McLaren to win, they've not, and then every weekend I predicted.
So you're just
haven't.
intentionally going to start picking against McLaren?
Yeah, I'm just like, all right, we'll lock out the bottom of the podium, and be like, oh,
Oh, I'm so surprised.
Lando won. So,
well, hey, that was
not
a
like
fun
we're giving
one.
betting advice, don't do none of that.
We're not doing any of that. But no, this was a good one. We're going to catch you guys next week post-race. Next Thursday, we're going to be dropping here on YouTube, Spotify, Apple. We'll have all that stuff ready to go for you. But thank you so much for listening to this. I'm Tristan Rines. That's Kevin Walker. This has been the Lap Podcast, Episode 4. We will catch you guys next time.